Did you know that sugar was the main cause of the slave trade? But first, let's talk about the origins of sugar and how it spread through war and colonization. So sugarcane is said to have first been cultivated here, was then refined into sugar crystals for the very first time here, and then that technology was further developed and studied here. But when the Muslims conquer Persia as part of their expanding empire, they fall in love with sugar. They master the process of refining it and transform it into a huge industry with the world's first sugar plantations. But under their rule, sugar becomes a coveted delicacy, a sign of wealth. It's incorporated into sweets and presented in the lavish displays of Islamic rulers. Fast forward to the Crusades. That's when Christian armies from Europe invaded the Holy Land, setting off centuries of war with Muslim armies seeking to drive them out. When the Christians take over Jerusalem, they learn about sugar production from the Muslims, and then take that sugar back home with them to Europe, and poof, Europe also falls in love with sugar. Well, the rich Europeans that could afford it, that is. An upper middle class European in medieval times could only afford 1 teaspoon of it per year.
Teaspoon? Set all.
Still, for the extremely wealthy, sugar was a cherished seasoning, a sweetener, a preservative, and even a much sought-after medicine.
Sugar moderately cleans the blood, strengthens body and mind, especially the chest, lungs, and throat.
Still, refined sugar was super labor-intensive to make, and it had to pass through many middlemen before landing in Europe, making it too pricey for the masses. So, to bring costs down, both the Europeans and the Muslims started using enslaved people to produce sugar. It first began in the Mediterranean with enslaved people from Greece, Russia, and Turkey, to name a few. But then this idea of using slavery starts to spread like wildfire, especially among the Europeans. Some of them see an opportunity here to enrich themselves beyond anyone's imagination. And it involves violently enslaving people from Africa on a massive scale to produce more sugar more cheaply than ever before, and especially on islands. By the 1400s, the Spanish and the Portuguese are racing to colonize islands off the west coast of Africa. They're on a quest to find a sea route to Asia. But once they get to these islands, they establish sugar plantations and enslave the indigenous people and people from nearby Africa to work on them. This happens on one island after another, after another, after another. All this kicks into overdrive when the Europeans discover the New World in a quest to extract more riches from new lands. By the 1500s, their insatiable desire for sugar helps fuel a competition to colonize the Americas. And, I must add, almost every Caribbean island they could find. The Spanish colonized islands like Cuba, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and Hispaniola, and build sugar plantations. The British colonized Barbados, St. Kitts and Nevis, the British Virgin Islands, Trinidad and Tobago, and so on. Oh, and they take Jamaica from the Spanish. More sugar plantations. The French follow suit and colonize a bunch of different islands of their own, and take over the western part of Hispaniola from the Spanish, the area we now know as Haiti today. And again, more sugar plantations. Then there's the Portuguese, who colonized Brazil, turning it into a sugar production powerhouse for the whole world. Oh, and of course there's the Dutch, who also claimed a big part of the colonialism pie. The more places the Europeans colonized, the more sugar plantations they established, and the more African people were violently enslaved and shipped over to work the fields. This was a brutal enterprise, with enslaved Africans often being worked until they dropped dead. Many plantation owners even preferred buying new slaves rather than ensuring the survival of their current slaves. Meanwhile, back in Europe, cheap sugar started to flood the market. Sugar became an everyday item accessible to the poorest of the working poor. And it's important to remember why it was so cheap. Stolen land and slaves. This exchange of goods and human beings came to be known as the transatlantic slave trade. Today, many estimate that between 10 and 12 million enslaved African people were transported in the slave trade by European powers between the 1500s and the 1800s. And Europe's slave-based plantation model was very, very heavily borrowed by the people who founded this place. But instead of just sugar, cash crops like tobacco, rice, and cotton were also farmed on plantations run by enslaved Africans, making money for the European-descended peoples who colonized this land. It wasn't until the 1800s that slavery started to be banned in different parts of the Western world. But even then, enslaved African people were then replaced with indentured laborers from East India and China. And for the enslaved Africans in the US, many of the conditions of slavery continued even after slavery, but under new laws. And even today, the sugar industry continues to exploit workers. There's reports of forced labor in the sugar fields of Brazil and the Dominican Republic, or child labor in the sugar fields of India, Guatemala, El Salvador, and more. So sugar may be sweet and delicious, but the history, not so much.